Hello everyone, welcome to week 3 of EDST 536. The topic this week is Indigenization and Decolonization of Canadian Higher Education. Instead of offering an itinerary for this week's lecture, I'm just going to offer the guiding questions for this week, which essentially follow the order of the lecture. And as always, these are questions to keep in mind as you watch the lecture, but also as you do your readings and as you think about our conversations in our weekly discussion sessions. So the first question is, what is the historical context that has made indigenization and decolonization of Canadian higher education necessary? What is the current social context that has made it viable, at least to a certain extent? What are some of the problems that have been identified with conditional forms of inclusion? What are some of the challenges involved in enacting substantive forms of indigenization and decolonization? What frameworks and processes, rather than checklists, could support indigenization and decolonization? And how would the different approaches to reform understand indigenization and decolonization? So first, a bit of context. This echoes some of the conversations we had last week, but essentially, if it were not for colonialism, then Canadian universities as we know them would not exist. The process of claiming Indigenous land and removing Indigenous peoples from those lands was what enabled universities like UBC to be built. And in addition to using the land itself, some schools actually, in their early days, had it as part of their mission to educate Indigenous youth. Now, we might quibble over the term educate. Some people would actually say that the intention was assimilation. But there was some Indigenous presence early on. But for the most part, until the mid-20th century, very few Indigenous people attended Canadian universities. And this was because various reasons again, but one of them being that from 1876 until 1951, if Indigenous people chose to attend Canadian universities, they would lose their formal federal recognition as an Indigenous person. So they would lose their treaty rights, is another way of saying that. And they would be incorporated into the Canadian body politic as if they were any other Canadian. They would lose their rights as Indigenous people. So for that and other reasons, most chose not to do that. Now, in the post-World War II era, the federal government changed its tune a bit, and as a means of promoting what it called integration, it offered more scholarships for Indigenous people. Like the term educating from earlier, we could question whether this was a true and equitable integration or if it was, again, a move of assimilation. But in any case, there were more Indigenous people attending at this time. However, they were generally expected to adapt to existing institutional contexts and programs, and by the 1970s, there was a pushback against this in both higher education and K-12 education of Indigenous peoples seeking greater control over their own education, including some seeking more access to what we might call white stream or mainstream universities. So, as a result of this, there was the first Native or Indigenous Studies program in 1969 at Trent University, and since then there have been several others that have been established. And also in the 1970s, there was established essentially a federal fund for funding of post-secondary higher education for Indigenous students. This was for First Nations and Inuit students, not for Métis students, or for Indigenous students who didn't have federal recognition of their Indigenous status for various reasons. So this already prevented some students from accessing the fund, but also in 1989, the fund was capped in terms of how much it could offer, and the formula was changed, which meant that it covered fewer and fewer costs for Indigenous students attending, and that it actually was available to fewer students as well. So there have been since then calls to amplify this federal funding, and in fact, in the Truth and Reconciliation report's calls to action, there is a suggestion that the federal government should increase federal funding for post-secondary education. and provide access for more students. In general, we can say that the current changes that we're seeing now are the latest development in decades and even centuries-long efforts, mostly led by Indigenous people, to transform and access Canadian universities. These changes, again, usually led by Indigenous people. It's usually institutions or governments that are responding to that pressure, even when they frame their changes as benevolent gestures or actions. Usually they are responding to some kind of pressure and they want to save face. And there's a sort of interesting dynamic that we're looking at now, because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has enabled certain conversations to be on the table that were not there before. At the same time, we have the dynamic of what we might call conditional inclusion, and I'll talk more about that later, but where, again, people are included but on the institution's terms, rather than on the terms of Indigenous peoples or the communities that they come from. So there's a constant sort of negotiation and increasingly a frustration with the perception that institutions are indigenizing or decolonizing in very tokenistic ways. So the Truth and Reconciliation has allowed more space for that conversation to happen, including allowing the conversation to be pushed further and further for Indigenous people to seek a more substantive transformation of higher education. But they also receive a lot of pushback from the institution, and we're going to talk about some of that today. So just to clarify a bit, there are different terms at play here, and these terms are all contested. There is no definitive meaning of what indigenization means, or decolonization, or reconciliation. I've taken these definitions from a document that was produced in the province of BC about indigenizing post-secondary institutions. So we can use these definitions if they are useful. So indigenization is defined as a process of naturalizing Indigenous knowledge systems and making them evident to transform spaces, places, and hearts. And decolonization is the process of deconstructing colonial ideologies of the superiority and privilege of Western thought and approaches. And reconciliation is about addressing past wrongs done to Indigenous peoples, making amends, and improving relationships. Again, this is just one set of definitions. There are many more, and even amongst Indigenous people, there are disagreements about what these terms do or should mean. So when you're entering these conversations, understand that we can't always assume that we're all talking about the same thing, even if we are using the same general term. In particular, we note that there is this pushback, as I mentioned, against institutions taking up terms like decolonization or like indigenization, but doing them in very tokenistic ways that leaves the underlying structures of colonialism in place. There's a quite well-known article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. If you haven't read it, I would recommend it if you're interested in this topic. And it's by Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang, again, pushing back on the way that decolonization has been adopted into education and basically put in a mix of other terms about social justice and social change without attending to the specificities of the settler colonial context in a place like Canada, and particularly without addressing the fact that if we don't return Indigenous land, then we're not really decolonizing. Again, this is not a universal stance. Not everyone agrees with this or this framing, but it is definitely something to keep on the table and keep in mind as a position that, generally speaking, is not acknowledged by our institutions, but that some Indigenous people are really pushing for. And part of that pushing is coming out of a frustration with the process of reconciliation and feeling that it really has done very little to substantively change the relationship between Indigenous peoples and other Canadians. So we had, especially this spring, with the struggles over the Wet'suwet'en territory and the pipeline building, this claim that reconciliation is dead. I don't know if you have seen this, but it is another wrinkle in this process. So some Indigenous peoples are saying not only are we frustrated with this topic, but we're not even willing to have the conversation anymore. We need a different kind of conversation. So these are all different perspectives to keep in mind when we're talking about this topic of institutional transformation and different critical responses. So one way we can frame the frustration with the way that institutions have taken up decolonization, indigenization, and reconciliation is this notion of conditional inclusion, which I partly draw from Sarah Ahmed's work, who has this great book called On Being Included, and if you haven't read it, I would also recommend it if this is a topic that interests you. She's not talking just about Indigenous people, she's talking about the experiences of racialized people as well, but really focusing on the fact that when difference is included in higher education, when historically and systemically marginalized communities are included, it rarely changes the underlying structures and power dynamics of the institutions. People are invited in, but they're invited only if they meet certain criteria, and only if, once they are invited, they don't push back too much. They don't ask for too much change. They go along with the business as usual and actually express gratitude for being included. So there's a pushback against this kind of conditional inclusion, which we summarize as business as usual plus non-threatening content, Indigenous content in this case, minus the guilt and risk of bad press. So in other words, institutions will include Indigenous people and Indigenous content if that means they continue on as usual. They can add a bit of Indigenous knowledge, but only if it's not threatening. And they will get the benefit of some of the political pressure being taken off because it looks like they've done something substantive. We can also see this metaphor here that Sarah Ahmed talks about people who are working on things like decolonization or diversification of institutions generally hit a brick wall. And while it's not acknowledge that that wall is there on an institutional level, when they're doing that work, that's how it feels. We can take that metaphor a step further and say that, generally speaking, conditional inclusion is saying you can come into our brick wall, but only if you fit into that square shape. So that's what the image here is trying to express. We also have this notion of the hidden bricks of inclusion coming from Kasia Henneque, who is a professor in our department, and Siriana Napi, who was a PhD student in our department, now a professor. And they talk about 4 hidden bricks of inclusion that, again, Indigenous people experience in this process of decolonization and indigenization of the university, but that are generally disavowed or denied by the institution as being there. So the first they have is inclusion as performance without substance. And this is essentially when institutions will include superficial forms of Indigenous difference, but only if that difference makes no difference. So an example of that would be including more Indigenous art on campus, but not actually substantively changing relationships of the institution to Indigenous communities or attending to the experiences of Indigenous staff, faculty, and students. So it looks on the surface like something's happening, but in fact, not much has really shifted. Another one is saying it without doing it, and this relates to the first, but it's essentially making a strong public commitment to indigenization or decolonization without following it up with really much action. So we can ask a question, for instance, in regard to President Ono's apology that he made in 2018 for UBC's role in the Indian residential schools, which we talked about, and ask whether this was saying it and doing it or saying it without doing it. And I think we probably have to ask Indigenous peoples on campus whether they felt like the apology and the statement of commitment to transform relationships was actually followed through with substantive action. The Daigle piece from this week would suggest no, but of course that's only one perspective. Then we have inclusion as a form of debt. So in other words, inclusion is generally treated as an act of charity, by those who are doing the including or the institution to the person who is included. So it's treated as charity rather than, for instance, an effort to address systemic and historical injustice. And those who are included are then expected to be grateful for this charity or generosity, and thus not expected to challenge business as usual. Finally, inclusion as expecting translation. So those who are included are said, yes, you can come in, but we want you to play the role of translator between your knowledge system and the knowledge system that dominates in the institution. And you have to make it understandable to us in our frameworks, even if that means that you're not really honoring your own knowledge systems. The most important thing is that you make it intelligible for us. And if it's not intelligible for us, then we don't count it as knowledge. So this is the kind of extra additional labor that Indigenous faculty and students are expected to do at the institution that is not generally recognized as labor, but it's not the kind of thing that, for instance, white faculty or students are expected to do. The other wrinkle in all of this is that when these dynamics occur and when Indigenous people point them out, generally speaking, they meet a lot of resistance from white and some non-white faculty and students. And this is captured in what Lisa Taylor in this image calls the D's of resistance. So the ways we resist difficult knowledge, especially knowledge about the fact that we might be complicit in colonial harm. So one of the D's would be denial, and saying, I don't believe that that thing happened to you, if someone tells you a story about how they experienced colonialism. Or they would condemn or blame the others without taking responsibility for themselves, saying, I don't believe that people could do such a thing. How could they be so violent? Which, on the one hand, sounds like a reasonable response, but it sort of suggests that you're not taking responsibility for the fact that you're complicit in that violence as well. Or other people responses might be saying it's not my fault, I didn't do it, that was my ancestors, I had no part in it, why are you still worried about it? So there are various strategies, in other words, that non-Indigenous people will use to deflect the difficult conversations that we need to have about the ways that colonialism in our institutions continues to exist. And what this suggests as well is that the issue of decolonization and indigenization of higher education is not just an intellectual issue. It's not just an issue of ignorance that we don't know these histories. On some level, it is true that, generally speaking, these histories and the ongoing processes of colonialism are rarely acknowledged or centered in our conversations. But even when people have the intellectual knowledge, that doesn't mean that they shift their investments or the desires that they have that rests on the continuation of colonialism. And thus, when those desires or entitlements are challenged, when conditional inclusion is challenged, we tend to get defensive and deflect or deny. So it's not just a shift at the intellectual level of learning more about these histories and ongoing processes, but also at an affective or emotional level to see, how am I responding when someone brings this up? I'm not just responding on an intellectual level, I'm responding emotionally as well. And what is behind those responses? And I would be great if we could talk a bit about that in our discussions for this week. So, if we want to move toward decolonization, I think one of the things to recognize is that it's not a checklist. Many people have pointed this out. Generally speaking, this is what is demanded of Indigenous people. Okay, you want this change, tell us how to do it. And this is something that, for instance, Tuck and Yang, in their article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, really push back against and say, there is no checklist. This is a really difficult, long-term process. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like at the end because we're still in such a colonial context that to imagine decolonization is actually quite difficult. So part of this means if we're really committed to decolonization and or indigenization, it means being committed to a long-term, difficult, messy, non-linear process of change. And it also means attending to the many different ways that colonialism shapes our institutions. So as a kind of concluding section, I have these questions around different dimensions of colonialism in the institution. I won't read them all. I'm going to upload these slides as always, but I'll read one from each. So if we think about the historical dimensions of colonialism, we can ask, and this relates to our discussion last week, how does the colonial past shape the colonial present? And what are the contemporary responsibilities we have in relation to that past and how they inform the present? For the political dimension, we can ask, in what ways do universities contribute to the socialization of settler citizens in a colonial country that presume the inevitability of colonialism and therefore reproduce it as they become the leaders of society? An economic dimension question might be, how do universities derive profits from the development of Indigenous lands? So not just being on Indigenous lands themselves, but actually getting profit from owning Indigenous lands. And that relates to the article we discussed last week about UBC and Westbrook Village, for instance. The intellectual dimension, this would be a question, for instance, about, are non-Indigenous peoples expecting Indigenous people to engage in the pedagogical labor that should be their own responsibility? So in other words, are non-Indigenous people expecting Indigenous people to do all the translating for them, to teach them about colonialism, to teach them about racism, instead of taking on that labor themselves? The affective dimension. So how do I react when someone suggests that my ideas or my actions reproduce colonialism? Am I willing to be held accountable for my inevitable mistakes? And I think especially when you're reading the articles for this week, and especially the Daigle piece, I encourage you to think about how you're responding affectively in addition to intellectually to the article, because that might teach us something about where we're at in relation to these concepts. None of the reactions are bad, but we have to take responsibility for them and asking where they're coming from. What kinds of assumptions or investments might the article be challenging, and how are we responding to that, and how might we respond differently in a more generative way? So just to close, I want to come back to the different approaches to reform and think about how decolonization relates to them. So a minor reform meaning of decolonization might be simply inclusion of Indigenous peoples and knowledges into existing institutions, programs, and curricula. This is the most common understanding of what decolonization means. And it might look like, in addition to actually including more people, providing additional resources to Indigenous students, but specifically to equip them with the skills and knowledge to excel according to existing institutional standards, which in many cases we can say are, generally speaking, Eurocentric standards of excellence. So the major reform would push back on this minor reform approach and say, we don't just need inclusion, we need actual recognition of Indigenous peoples and our knowledges. We need to redistribute resources to Indigenous peoples. We need better representation of Indigenous peoples, not just as a tokenistic gesture, but actually as being central to the mission of the university and to our curricula. So the idea would be, in practice, to center and empower Indigenous peoples, their voices and knowledges on campus, and redistribute and reappropriate material resources. So for instance, free tuition for Indigenous students would be a demand from this space. Then finally, the beyond reform approach would say that we need to dismantle institutional complicity in political, economic, relational, and affective colonial processes, and this might mean dismantling the institution itself for some people. So in the practical consideration, it would be use institutional resources that are currently available in subversive ways to support Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous communities and people, and play the game of the institution to an extent, but also try to change that game or maybe even get rid of the game entirely. So I hope that this lecture has captured for you some of the complexity of the conversation about indigenization and decolonization in terms of the different meanings of this term for different people, but also in terms of the dynamics involved in actually enacting institutional change, and just how difficult it is, how colonial investments and colonial structures are very well established and therefore very difficult to move. And in many cases, good intentions of individuals or institutions are not enough, and they might in fact reproduce the same colonial patterns. So how can we interrupt those colonial patterns for long enough to see how they get reproduced in our institutions and in ourselves, so that we might have a chance of a decolonial future for higher education? That's it for this week. Thank you.